Hey everybody, got kind of a treat today. Guitar Player magazine from December 1973. Although, you know what? Instead of going through the whole magazine, I thought we'd focus on the very interesting article in here on one Jeff Beck. That's the cover, and we've got a great picture of Jeff Beck. This Guitar Player magazine from 1973, there's not as much nice color photography in it. It's kind of, and the paper's cheaper. So it's not quite as conducive to going through page by page. It's still great. It's a 52-year-old magazine. Look at that picture of Jeff Beck. But Jeff Beck's on the cover, and I thought we'd do kind of a shortish video on just this Jeff Beck article. It occurs to me in 1973, Jeff Beck was super famous, but that was around the time he was playing with Carmen Appice and Tim Bogert. And I hope, is that Tim Bogerty or Bogert? I hope I got that right. But we'll zoom in. But his solo career hadn't really taken off, and it's a pretty interesting period. So he says some kind of interesting things in here about the Yardbirds. The article's not that long. Let's just look at a couple things. First, we got some. See, black and white. The pages are a little grainy. So Blow by Blow and Wired hadn't come out yet. which I think were the two albums that kind of, and you know, like Jan Hammer, some of the mid and late 70s stuff, Jeff Beck Live with Jan Hammer. But boy, in this period, he had already done those albums with Rod Stewart, which this album, this magazine doesn't really mention those too much. You know, those great albums he did with Rod Stewart. That's the original Jeff Beck group, which I think now I would have to say, in my opinion, are two of the great guitar albums ever made. Blues, those first two albums with Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood and Jeff Beck, super good. But look what it says here. This is 1973. Currently playing with Vanilla Fudge Cactus Rhythm Section Carmine Appice and Tim Bogert. So it is Tim Bogert, not Bogerty. The thin-figured Beck is only one of a small handful of early wave British guitarists who has continued to produce music which satisfies both creatively and technically. A contemporary of Beck, Jimmy Page, has failed to create the magic he performed as guitarist for the Yardbirds. Look at this. They're saying Jimmy Page is... 1973, Led Zeppelin, what, Houses of the Holy came out? Look, they're cutting down Led Zeppelin. A contemporary of Beck, Jimmy Page, has failed to recreate the magic he performed as guitarist for the Yardbirds. Led Zeppelin started off as nothing more than a grandiose reproduction of Beck's past work with Rod Stewart. Witness Zeppelin's first album. Boy, oh boy, I sure don't agree with that. And I think Led Zeppelin 1 is one of the best rock albums ever made. Definitely, you know, no offense to Jeff Beck, but it's definitely better than anything Jeff Beck was ever on, in my opinion, at least for the I'm not saying guitar playing wise necessarily, maybe even that, but it's definitely one of the great all-time albums, Led Zeppelin 1. Look what they say about it here. Led Zeppelin started off as nothing more than a grandiose reproduction of Beck's past work with Rod Stewart, Witness Zeppelin's first album. And although Page's playing on that debut album would make any guitarist's fingernails fall off, that disc was still, all in all, highly unoriginal. Boy, oh boy, I sure don't agree with that. And even the most fanatical Eric Clapton patron wouldn't quibble over the fact that after his short-lived brilliance with Cream, he ran an uphill race. By the way, this would be in the period when Eric Clapton was in hiatus, but it maybe shows that the Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs was kind of below the radar, too. You know, that's an interesting point, that Led Zeppelin, Derek and the Dominoes, and even a lot of the Jeff Beck stuff, today it's so iconic because it's been listened to all these years. In 1973, I don't think people really understood what they had yet. Like that kind of just dismissing Eric Clapton's work after Cream. I happen to think Blind Faith is better than Cream. It's kind of dismissed there. And I definitely think Derek and the Dominoes, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs was great. And it just shows you that Layla and that whole album was kind of overlooked. Jeff Beck was in Los Angeles for a series of concerts with his newfound trio, and during the 2-hour interview made false the rumors that he eats reporters for breakfast. At once fascinating and amiable, the legendary guitarist became acquainted with the vodka and tonic while talking about his playing, his amplifiers, his guitars, and his feelings about the music scene. Let's see a couple things. What was his first guitar? What's the first guitar that you ever got a hold of? A friend of mine had a guitar, a beaten up old acoustic thing. It had about one string, but that's all I needed because I couldn't use any more. Then that broke, and where are we going to get another one? I didn't know. I took bits of an old piano wire and stuck it on. So he made his own guitar. You always hear me joke about screen door wire strings. Yeah, listen to this. Yeah, I made a guitar. The first one I made was out of a piece of cigar box, and then I progressed on that. Cut the front and back out of plywood and made streamed round sides, glued it all together. My old man threw it out in the garden because I had a row with him. Busted it. So he had a fight with his dad. His dad threw his guitar in the garden. But look, Jeff Beck talks about stealing here. You know, you hear some of these guys, they came up kind of from the rough side. I've heard Barry Gibb talks about stealing, you know, when he's a little kid, shoplifting stuff, you know, ripping people off. Look what he says. His dad threw his guitar in the garden, and I had so little money, and that was the thing I wanted to do so much. I'd go down to the shop and wait till the place was pretty packed out, and then I whipped out one of those pickups right out of the shop. It sold for about £2, this pickup. That's about $6. Oh, boy. I couldn't have cared if I got thrown in jail for 6 months. I had my pickup. And there was a little hole cut in the guitar that had been waiting for that pickup for about 8 months, and it fit it perfectly because I had already got the dimensions from a plan, and it just slipped right in there with 2 screws, and boy, I was the king. I used to deliberately carry my guitar around without a case so everyone would see it and see what it looked like. Yeah. And he's talking about he was playing Eddie Cochran stuff, but nobody was into it. I would say that's a theme to me of Jeff Beck's career is the search for a kind of a signature sound, a style. I think he hit it later in his career, but in this period, seemed like he was, you know, and a lot of them were. I think you can say that about Clapton too, but definitely kind of looking for a sound, looking for a style that wasn't just imitative of everybody else. I think he struggled finding that more than others. Also, people to play with. He had so many different players he played with. That's hard. Did you ever have any training or lessons? Spanish guitar. There were rumors going around my school that you couldn't possibly play any guitar, any electric guitar, unless you had proper classical training. And I was a bit thick then, and I said, right, okay, where do we start? And went straight up to the guy, and he knew less than I did. Yeah. Okay, now gets some pretty interesting stuff. Here he's talking about the Telecaster, the famous Yardbirds Telecaster. And by the way, today, that's one of the number one selling guitars Fender makes is the Jimmy Page Telecaster. Look, but no one knew that back then, but he's talking about the Telecaster. Listen, you used the Telecaster as the first guitar you played with the Yardbirds. Yeah, there was a group called the Walker Brothers. Does anyone know the Walker Brothers? There was John and Scott and Gary Walker, and it was John Walker who had an Esquire that I really fell in love with. So Jeff Beck had an Esquire, you know, and I've got that 70th anniversary Esquire, which is a great guitar. So Jeff Beck had an Esquire. He sold it to me for $75, and because it had a blonde, he sold it for about $75, and because it had a blonde neck and a black scratch plate, pick guard, it was just one of the most sought-after guitars in England. That's an Esquire. All the guitar freaks would go, hey, and they'd all been putting on the black scratch plates, but it didn't have the blonde neck to go with it. And I had the blonde neck. By the way, blonde neck, I guess he means maple neck, right? I was the cat's whiskers again. I'd been playing with this Esquire and just come to grips with it, and I gave my other Telecaster to Jimmy Page. Now that's the Jimmy Page mirror Telecaster he's talking about. So look, it's just kind of little mentioned here, but today that's rock and roll lore, rock and roll history, the myth of the Telecaster. But look what he says here. I've been playing this Esquire, and I just come to grips with it, and I gave my other Telecaster to Jimmy Page. He used to play like that, and he had it painted all psychedelic, and he has a silver finger plate on it, a scratch plate. That's the mirror Telecaster. First, Jimmy Page put mirrors on it. That's the one I have. And then he painted dragon psychedelic art on there with the silver scratch plate, and that's the Mexican version that also sells. I've never played one of those. But I have the mirror Telecaster. It's really nice. Were you using any fuzz boxes or boosters with the Yardbirds? I used to use a fuzz box, no other attachments. Used the Vox C30 for an amp. But he said, he thought that didn't really cut it when they started to get really loud. What was your first experience with feedback? Well, that was unavoidable because playing in small clubs, you always get feedback because of bad systems. and really the electrical thing hadn't been sewn up. All the amps were underpowered and screwed up full volume and always whistling. So they'd get a lot of feedback. The ideal thing was to get the beauty of the feedback, but controllable feedback. So feedback ended up, of course, being really cool. There he is playing a Strat. Feedback became really cool, but controllable feedback. Had Eric Clapton been using feedback back then? No, I never heard him. So I don't know. Is that true? Eric Clapton didn't use much feedback? I don't know if that's true. When you smash guitar, okay, he used to smash guitars. Was it more out of frustration or anger? So he did smash some guitars, and blow by blow he smashes the guitar, right? But I think it was more like being ticked off and kind of having I don't want to say hissy fit, but getting all ticked off on stage, whereas like Pete Townsend, it was part of the show. How many guitars did you break with the Yardbirds? Okay, now here he talks about the Les Paul. When you form the first Jeff Beck group, that would be the Rod Stewart. You notice they don't even talk much about that Rod Stewart-Ronnie Wood pairing. That, to me, is one of the best guitar albums ever. You know, the first Jeff Beck group and then Beckola, which have Ronnie Wood and Jeff Beck. When you form the first Jeff Beck group, you change it to a Les Paul. Yeah, that was from hearing Eric Clapton with the Blues Breakers. The difference was the amazing quality of the instrument. You know, the Fenders are so cheap and feel. You pick up a Les Paul and it's heavy and it really means something. It means business. And then I found that I was doing things I never dreamed I could. Mostly played Fenders all my life, but recently coming to appreciate Gibsons, I'm just kind of finding this interesting that when a Fender player starts to savor what a Gibson really is, it's sort of an awakening. It's like moving from beer to champagne or something. And I like the fact that a Gibson is a little heavier. They're always trying to make them lighter and acting like that's a negative. Maybe, I guess if you're playing in a bar for 4 hours, that heaviness does matter, so I'm not minimizing that factor. But it is nice to play a little heavier guitar. It's a little more substantial. Some of the people want them so light. That Fender Esquire I have, I don't think it weighs 7 pounds. People love that. But sometimes it's nice to play a guitar. It's got a little weight to it, you know, and I think that adds to the sustain. It also makes you feel, you know, it's kind of a big boy's instrument, you know. So I kind of get what Jeff Beck's saying here. So look what he says here. And he was playing a Les Paul, and he found he was doing things that I never dreamed I could. What types of things? Well, just general things like chords. Chords were a bit of a pain in the butt because, well, the Fender was nice because you could grip it like a weapon and really chunk out the chords. But when you came to the more subtle stuff, it wasn't there. There was just no sustain. You just kind of fluffed up a few runs. But on the Les Paul, you couldn't. You'd fluff up because you'd attempt something really hard. But you knew darn well that with a little bit of practice, you'd get it. And then after a while, I got so used to the Les Paul, there was no turning back. I picked up the Fender and thought, how the hell did I ever play this? Wow, so he likes the Les Paul. That's interesting. So, yeah, I guess he didn't play any Gibsons in the Yardbirds. I know when I think of the Yardbirds and Jeff Beck, I'll stand corrected, but I always think of him playing those Tellys and the Esquire. Now, here he talks about the Strat. Did you find that when you use the Stratocaster that it tends to go out of tune when you use the tremolo bar? Here's another interesting question. It depends on how you've got it strung up. If you've got good, really settled in strings that are strung, then it'll stay in tune. If you've got a very cheap brand of strings that'll stretch all over, let's see here. You're going to put it out of tune in no time. What kind of strings are you using? Look at, I don't know. We just buy them by the gross. Look, I feel like people were more blasé about gear then. You didn't have all these gear cork sniffers. You didn't, you know. When did you start using Marshall amps? Well, I didn't really care what I plugged into so long as I could be heard. It wasn't after a lot of volume. that I used to ask other groups and roadies what trouble do they have with amps blowing up every 5 minutes. And the unanimous vote seemed to be Marshall's. So he just said, playing really loud all the time and not blowing your amp up by, having it on dimed out all night, going through all these amps that would break. He said, what's the one that really can wear and tear, playing loud all night? And it was the Marshall boosters. When did you first start playing slide? In the Yardbirds, an Elmore James thing we used to do called I Done Wrong, but that was just fun to play. I never tuned a guitar to a chord. It just was open. I agree with that. I don't like tuning guitars to chords. Was there any reason? It meant changing over, and I thought it looked terrible on stage, watching a guy change over on a guitar. I just like to stand there after a number and look cool. I didn't want to have to do all this sort of toiletry. So, I agree with that, too. You get a good guitar and play it all night for the most part. Maybe if you go to an acoustic or something. But I got to play this guitar for this song or this guitar for that song. When you think about a lot of those classic bands, that's what they sort of did, Page with his, he might get out that Rickenbacker or Dan Electro for Cashmere or something, but mostly just played that Les Paul or maybe the double neck on a song or two. Do you think that since leaving the Yardbirds and forming your own groups that you were able to play more free? Yeah, but I had so much more freedom I didn't know what to do with it. The other members of the Yardbirds would always have ideas, and that's probably where I played the most constructive, playing the most inventive. Now I'm just perfecting my technique. I'm not going anyplace. I hate to say it, but that's kind of Jeff Beck. Look, he's kind of slamming that Carmen Appice, Tim Bogert band, which I don't think that album was reviewed that well, actually. I think it's got good guitar playing on it, but it doesn't have the quality of the material's not there. That's why I can't really agree with that idea that Led Zeppelin 1 wasn't, I would never compare Led Zeppelin 1 to the stuff he did with Carmen Appice and Tim Bogert. Have you ever consciously tried to do any theatrics on stage? I never wanted to work something out before I thought, while I'm playing, I've got to move, so let's see if I can roll it all into one. I used to do little steps and stuff. Does it bother you, or do you find it a compliment that many people consider you the greatest rock guitarist to ever play? Do you feel that you constantly have to be creative and inventive? Well, it's nice because it's nice to be on the move, but I don't worry because I've got a little bit of time behind me. 6 years of playing in front of people. God, look at now we've grown up with Jeff Beck. Those of us, it's been 60 years, but here's talking about 6 years. I've got a little bit of time behind me. 6 years of playing in front of people, and I've got that amount of time to look at. It's not as if I've just broken in the last week, and I've got to worry. The more time I've got behind me, the better I can judge my own progression. Do you consider yourself a flash guitarist? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Why not? I would say kind of. Well, I don't try to baffle people. Come on. I can understand Mahavishnu because they've done what I wanted to do. Really, Mclaughlin is far more technically knowledgeable. I don't know half of what he knows. I don't know chords. I just never had to worry about those kind of chords because they weren't usable. Mclaughlin would come and watch me, wouldn't come and watch me, let me tell you. So when you started playing, you never realized that it would mushroom into what it is now. Oh, God, no, I had no idea. If you could have seen it all happening, would you have still stayed in it? This is Jeff Beck in 1973. No blow by blow, no Wired, no Jan Hammer Group, the Freeway Jam, all that stuff's not done yet. Yeah, I would have worked my balls off. I would have got it right. I wouldn't have wasted my time. But who knows? I might be wasting my time doing something now. Boy, he's not all that praising of his band with Bogert and Appice, is he? Something might be passing us both by now. If the press would give me a chance, I might come up with something new. They might not realize it, but I play from emotion. I've never consciously tried to be a flash. Emotion rules everything I do. Rick Gretsch, the last 5 years. That's blind faith. Anyway, we'll look at some more things in this magazine. But I found that pretty interesting, and I think one of my takeaways is Jeff Beck in 1973, already kind of an iconic figure, but you don't get a sense of the legacy artist of Jeff Beck. They don't even really mention any tracks or anything off that Rod Stewart album, those 2 Rod Stewart albums he did that are great. They also don't seem to think that much of Led Zeppelin. So Led Zeppelin really is, kind of not really become what it is today. Even though if you think about it, in 1973, Led Zeppelin had a bunch of good albums out. Led Zeppelin 4 had come out. Stairway to Heaven was out. But all that stuff became more famous, and FM radio wasn't really that mainstream in 73. By 78 or 79, FM radio was more mainstream. So things were going to change a lot in the next 5 years. But in 1973, music was still kind of underground rock. The same with Eric Clapton. They said Eric Clapton, has been struggling. They don't even really, the idea of Layla and the Derek and the Dominoes, they don't even really mention that. But I sort of think that's true about Jeff Beck. But it's just great to see. I thought it was interesting what he said about the Les Paul, and certainly interesting to see some of those comments back then about what's become one of the most famous guitars of rock history, which is the Telecaster that he played in the Yardbirds and then gave to Jimmy Page, which is today one of the signature Fender guitars. You can buy either the mirrored Telecaster white or the painted version with the dragon on it. Either way, great guitar. Jeff Beck, is that the ox blood guitar? I don't know, or black, but anyway, that's him playing a Les Paul. We're going to do Gordon Lightfoot next, so be on the lookout. Thanks. God bless.